It's very encouraging to see such a fantastic turnout for tonight's talk. It's especially good to see you here to listen to and engage with Dr. Henry Giroux, who in a moment will deliver his talk on public intellectuals and the crisis of higher education as a public good. First off, I would like to sincerely thank our partners, James Patton and McIntosh Gallery, Dean Carmichael and the Faculty of Information and Media Studies, Dean Schwayen of the Faculty of Education, and of course Dean Mildy of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. Thank you, all of you, for helping us put this together. We are very pleased to launch the first lecture of this year's Scholarship of Engagement lecture series with Dr. Giroux, and to host a reception afterwards at McIntosh Gallery to see Jason McLean's exhibition, If You Could Read My Mind. So if you get a chance, please do join us afterwards for refreshments. We're also very pleased to have the opportunity to bring together faculty, students, invited guests, and members of the London community. When I first asked Dr. Giroux if he would speak for the public humanities at Western, I was aware that booking a world-class scholar in high demand was a tall order. Yet once Dr. Giroux had heard about the public humanities' commitment to promoting engaged forms of democratic citizenship, he not only agreed to speak for us, he began sending me articles that he thought might be interesting or helpful for both me and the public humanities team. This response was nothing short of inspiring, especially considering Dr. Giroux's numerous commitments and his prolific publishing record, which includes more than 50 books and 300 articles. Throughout his work, Dr. Giroux has unwaveringly defended institutions of higher education as forms for promoting critically engaged citizenship and the cultivation of shared public values. But it would be remiss to characterize his work with only the verb defend, because there are few thinkers today who wage such consistent offensives against the institutions and ideologies that have landed higher education in its current crisis. Stanley Aronowitz has aptly noted that, quote, Dr. Giroux insists on thinking beyond the boundaries established by conservatives and depressed liberals, end quote. Famed pedagogical critic Paulo Freire has said that, quote, Giroux's thought does not allow those who approach him to be indifferent, end quote. In addition to the praise he has garnered from his peers, Dr. Giroux has received numerous honors and awards for his work. In 1998 and 1999, he received the Distinguished Visiting Lectureship in Art Education at the Art Institute of Chicago. In 2000, he won the Getty Research Institute's Visiting Scholar Award. And in 2002, Routledge named him one of the top 50 educational thinkers of the modern period. He currently holds the Global TV Network Chair in English and Cultural Studies at McMaster University. In 2011, he founded the Public Intellectuals Project with truthout.org and at McMaster. The Public Intellectuals Project is dedicated to, quote, supporting higher education and other cultural spheres as vital places to think and act collectively in the face of a growing crisis of shared public values and meaningful democratic participation, end quote. Now as much as ever, we all need to confront and engage with the crisis that faces higher education as a public good. And it is with this need in mind that I'm very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Henry A. Giroux.
All right. I want to first let me thank you for coming. I know how hard it is at 5 o'clock in the evening to attend a public lecture. I mean, you could be home actually eating decent food, rather than having to be subjected to what I'm about to say in the next 30, 40 minutes. What I want to do is a couple of things. One is I want to talk about neoliberalism and sort of in some way articulate the threat that I think it increasingly presents to a whole range of institutions that in some ways refuse to completely define themselves by the logic of the commodity or the logic of privatization or the logic of deregulation. Secondly, I want to talk about the way that threat is sort of manifested in the university, the way in which we can begin to understand how the university is being attacked by virtue of some of the precepts, the ideology, the policies, and the modes of governance that we see emerging out of this neoliberal framework. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about public intellectuals in ways that hopefully will allow us to understand that the university, particularly at this time in history, may have a very particular responsibility to defend itself in light of the enormous attacks that it's now undergoing. With that, let me begin. With the advent of neoliberalism, we have witnessed the production and widespread adoption within many countries of what I want to call the politics of economic Darwinism. And as a theater of cruelty and mode of pedagogy, economic Darwinism not only believes in the ability of markets to solve all problems, it also removes economic and markets from ethical considerations and from social cost. In this discourse, economics drives politics, transforming citizens into consumers and social responsibility into an object of disdain. Long-term investments are now replaced by short-term profits, while compassion and concern for others are viewed as a weakness. Democratic public values are scorned because they subordinate market considerations to the common good. Morality, in this instance, simply dissolves as humans are stripped of any obligations to each other. How else to explain Mitt Romney? You know Mitt Romney? He's really a Disney creation. He was hatched in Florida in one of those tanks. How else to explain Mitt Romney's gaffe caught on video in which he derided 47% of the people who will vote for the president no matter what? There was more at work in that comment than what some have called a cynical political admission by Romney that some voting blocs don't matter. Romney's dismissive comments about those 47% of adult Americans who don't pay federal income taxes for one reason or another, whom he described as people who believe they are victims, people who believe the government has a responsibility to care for them, people who believe they're entitled to health care, to food, to housing, quote, you name it, makes clear that the logic of disposability is now a central feature, to say the very least, of American politics. I mean, after all, why would I want to be concerned about getting good health care? As the language of privatization, deregulation, and commodification replaces the discourse of the common good, all things public, including public schools, libraries, transportation systems, crucial infrastructures, and public services, these are now viewed as either a drain on the market or, in some cases, actually a pathology. I was actually at a meeting once with one of these leading sort of neoliberal ideologues. Chester Finn is his name. Some of you might know him, some of you I'm sure don't. But he was giving a talk about privatization, and he was saying, what would you rather do? Go to a private bathroom or go to a public bathroom? Would you rather ride in public transportation, or can you imagine yourself riding in a privately leased limo? And it went like on and on. You know, this endless disdain for this notion of the public, as if it's some kind of rabid virus that if you touch it, you know, you'll be on medication for the rest of your life. As the welfare state is dismantled and spending is cut to the point where government becomes unrecognizable, except to promote policies that benefit the rich, corporations, and the defense industry, the already weakened federal and state governments are increasingly replaced by the harsh realities of a punishing state that produce what Joe Bayol has called proliferating zones of social abandonment and terminal exclusion. The harsh values of this new social order can be seen in the increasing incarceration in the United States of young people, the modeling of public schools after prisons, and state policies that bail out investment bankers but leave the middle and working classes in a state of poverty, despair, and insecurity. Individual prosperity allegedly becomes the greatest of social achievements because it allegedly drives innovation and creates jobs. At the same time, massive disparities in income and wealth are celebrated as a justification for a kind of survival of the fittest ethic and a sort of homage to a ruthless mode of what we might call unbridled individualism. Vulnerable populations, once protected by the social state, are now considered a liability because they are viewed as either flawed consumers or present a threat to this right-wing Christian evangelical view of America as basically a white Protestant public sphere. This is not Canada, of course. The elderly, young people, the unemployed, immigrants, and poor whites and minorities of color now constitute a form of human waste and are considered disposable, unworthy of sharing in the rights, the benefits, and the protections of a substantive democracy. Clearly, this new politics of disposability and this culture of cruelty represents more than an economic crisis. It also speaks to a deeply rooted crisis in education, of agency, and social responsibility. Under such circumstances, to cite C. Wright Mills, we are witnessing the breakdown of democracy, the disappearance of critical intellectuals, and the collapse of those public spheres which offer a sense of critical agency and social imagination. Since the 1970s, we have witnessed the forces of market fundamentalism strip education of its public values, critical content, and civic responsibilities as part of a broader goal of creating new subjects wedded to consumerism, risk-free relationships, the delete button, and the destruction of the social state. We're all on pause. Tied largely to instrumental purposes and measurable paradigms, many institutions of higher education are now committed almost exclusively to economic goals, such as preparing students for the workforce, even though there are no jobs for them. A paradox that higher education has yet to come to grips with. Universities have not only strayed from their democratic mission, they seem immune to the plight of students who have to face a harsh new world of high unemployment, the prospect of downward mobility, debilitating debt, and a future that mimics the failures of the past. The question of what kind of education is needed for students to be informed and active citizens is rarely asked. Hence, it is not surprising to read, for example, that Thomas College, a liberal arts college in Maine, advertises itself as the home of the guaranteed job. Oh my. Hello. Are you on the planet? Within both higher education and the educational force of the broader cultural apparatus, with its networks of knowledge production in the old and new media, we are witnessing the emergence and dominance of a powerful and ruthless, if not destructive, market-driven notion of education, freedom, and agency. And such modes of education do not foster a sense of organized responsibility central to a democracy. Instead, they often foster what might be called a sense of organized irresponsibility, a practice that underlies the economic Darwinism and civic corruption at the heart of American and, to a lesser degree, Canadian politics. The anti-democratic values that drive free market fundamentalism are embodied in policies now attempting to shape the diverse levels of higher education all over the globe. The script has now become overly familiar and increasingly, unfortunately, taken for granted, especially in the United States and increasingly in Canada. Shaping the neoliberal framing of public and higher education is a corporate-based ideology that embraces standardizing the curriculum, top-to-down governing structures. A corporate-based ideology that, for the most part, promotes entrepreneurial values and a reduction of all levels of education to job training sites. I mean, it's really quite amazing to hear these corporate types often talk about higher education, because what they often do is they often substitute the word training. And I'm sure it's not unconscious. You know, we need places that train people. I mean, the thought that education surpasses and moves beyond the parameters of what constitutes basically a very narrow, skill-based notion of education seems to elude them. For example, one university is offering a master's degree to students who commit to starting a high-tech company, while another office allows career officers to teach capstone research seminars in the humanities. And in one of these classes, the students were asked to develop a 30-second commercial on their personal brand. Central to this neoliberal view of education is a kind of market-driven paradigm that wants to eliminate tenure, turn the humanities into a job preparation service, and reduce most faculty to the status of part-time and temporary workers, if not simply a new subordinate class of disempowered educators. You all know that, for instance, now in the United States, 70% of all faculty are either part-time or non-tenured. 70%. The figure is now only 30% of the faculty. So this is really a kind of stripping away of faculty in ways that, of course, produce young people who are underpaid, barely reach the poverty level. Many of them are on food stamps, and many of them are teaching 6 courses a year. for $1,500 a course in some cases. There's no talk in this view of higher education about shared governance between faculty and administrators, nor of educating students as critical citizens rather than potential employees of Walmart. There's no attempt to affirm faculty as scholars and public intellectuals who have both a measure of autonomy and power. Instead, faculty members are increasingly defined less as intellectuals than as technicians and grant writers. Students fare no better in this kind of debased form of education and are treated either as consumers or as restless children in need of high-energy entertainment, as was made clear if you followed, of course, the Penn State scandal. Nor is there any attempt to legislate higher education as a fundamental sphere for creating agents necessary for an aspiring democracy. This neoliberal, corporatized model of higher education exhibits a deep disdain for critical ideas, public spheres, and practices that are not directly linked to market values, business culture, the economy, or the production of short-term financial gains. In fact, the commitment to democracy is beleaguered, viewed less as a crucial educational investment than as a distraction that gets in the way of connecting knowledge and pedagogy to the production of material and human capital. In the United States, many of the problems in higher education can be linked to low funding, the domination of university by market mechanisms, the rise of for-profit colleges, the intrusion of the national security state, and the lack of faculty self-governance, all of which only contradicts the culture and democratic value of higher education, but also makes a mockery of the very meaning and mission of the university as a democratic public sphere. Decreased financial support for higher education stands in sharp contrast to increased support for tax benefits for the rich, big banks, the defense budget, and mega corporations. Rather than enlarge the moral imagination and critical capacities of students, too many universities are now wedded to producing hedge fund managers, depoliticized students, and creating modes of education that promote a kind of technically trained docility. Strapped for money and increasingly defined in the language of corporate culture, many universities are now pulled or driven principally by vocational, military, and economic considerations, while increasingly removing academic knowledge production from democratic values and from projects, i.e. often translated into, what do the humanities do? Why do we need the liberal arts? Let's flee to the business school. College presidents are now called CEOs and speak largely in the discourse of Wall Street and corporate fund managers, while at the same time moving effortlessly between interlocking corporate and academic boards. And in fact, some of you might have seen an article that not too long appeared in the Chronicle where they looked at 7 or 8 major Ivy League universities, and every one of these presidents was on a corporate board, every one of them, pulling in to the tune, in some cases, of $350,000 a year for attending 2 or 3 annual meetings. Now you think about that in terms of the conflict of interest that might present between what these corporations do and the autonomy of the university. Brown University's president, for instance, she made a chunk of money. Venture capitalists scour colleges and universities in search of big profits to be made through licensing agreements, the control of intellectual property rights, and investments in university spin-off companies. In this new gilded age of money and profit, academic subjects gain stature almost exclusively through their exchange value on the market. And it gets worse. As exemplified by one recent example, BB&T Corporation, a financial holdings company, gave $1 million to Marshall University's business school on the condition, can you believe this, that Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, Paul Ryan's favorite book, be taught in the courses funded by this hedge fund guy. Can you imagine if I had $1 million and gave it to Mac and stipulated that, and I wouldn't, of course, say this, but that the Communist Manifesto be given to every student in the class? I mean, I'd be hanging from one of those buildings, in the middle of Mac. What do we make of the integrity of a university when it accepts a monetary gift from a corporation or rich patron, demanding as part of the agreement the power to specify what is taught in the course or how a curriculum should actually be shaped, or what faculty should be hired? We should maybe there's a representative from BlackBerry here who can fill us in. Some corporations and universities now believe that what is taught in the course is not an academic decision, but a market consideration. So that when you want to, if you're thinking about going into the university in the future, they won't be sending you to the dean. They'll be sending you to the public relations office. The market people will have their eyeglasses on, making sure that whatever you teach is going to bring in a specific amount of money. Not only does liberalism undermine both civic education and public values and confuse education with training, but it also treats knowledge as a product, promoting a neoliberal logic that views schools as malls, students as consumers, and faculty as entrepreneurs. It gets worse. As Stanley Aronowitz points out, the absurd neoliberal idea that users should pay for every public good, from parks and beaches to highways, has reached education with a vengeance, as more and more students are forced to give up attending college because of skyrocketing tuition rates. In addition, thousands of students are now saddled with debts that will bankrupt their lives in the future. Unfortunately, one measure of this disinvestment in higher education as a public good can be seen in the fact that many states, such as California, are spending more on prisons right now than they're spending on higher education. Educating low-income and poor minorities to be engaged citizens has been undermined by a kind of unholy alliance of law and order conservatives, private prison corporations, and prison guard unions, along with the rise, of course, the punishing state, all of whom have an invested interest in locking more people up, especially poor minority youth, than in actually educating them. It's no coincidence that in the United States and Canada, to a lesser degree, disinvesting in the institutions fundamental to democracy. And rather than invest, of course, in education, we increasingly find the emergence of a discourse which tells us that we really have to invest in what we might call the prison industrial criminal complex, that crime is the great problem, that in fact we need more prisons, we need to isolate more people, we need to put more people in jail for smoking marijuana or falling asleep on a streetcar, I don't know. But it seems to me that this move away from the social state into the punishing state is something that has to be looked at very, 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 very seriously. And one sees an incredible example of this, particularly in the United States, where you have young kids now who are in high schools who basically find themselves violating a high school rule. They don't deal with guidance teachers. They don't deal with teachers in the classroom. They now call the police to come in. And you have the police handcuffing 5-year-olds, taking you out to the local jail, booking them, getting fingerprints. I mean, it's madness. It's a kind of mad violence that saturates our country that really doesn't know how to understand what it means to talk about the obligations and the relationships that should be expressed by people living in a real democracy. The social cost of prioritizing, by the way, punishing over educating is clear in one shocking statistic provided by a recent study, which states that by the age of 23, almost a third of Americans, 30.2%, have been arrested for a crime. That which researchers say is a measure of the growing exposure to the criminal justice system in everyday life. Questions regarding how education might enable students to develop a keen sense of prophetic justice, claim their moral and political agency, utilize critical analytical skills, and cultivate an ethical sensibility through which they can learn to respect the rights of others are becoming increasingly irrelevant in a market-driven and militarized university. And as the humanities and liberal arts are downsized, privatized, and commodified, higher education finds itself caught in the paradox of claiming to invest in the future of young people while offering them few intellectual, civic, and moral supports. If the commercialization, commodification, and militarization of the university continue unabated, higher education will simply become another one of a number of institutions incapable of fostering critical inquiry, public debate, human acts of justice, and public values. But the calculating logic of the corporate university does more than diminish the moral and political vision and practices necessary to sustain a vibrant democracy and an engaged notion of social agency. It also undermines the development of public spaces where matters of dissent, critical dialogue, social responsibility, and social justice are pedagogically valued, viewed as fundamental, in this case, to providing students with the knowledge and the skills that they need to address problems facing the nation and the globe. to put it simply, knowledge that enables them to govern rather than simply be governed. Such democratic public spheres are especially important at a time when any space that produces critical thinkers capable of putting existing institutions into question are either under siege are often under siege by powerful economic and political interests. Many of you don't know this, but I mean, you really get a sense of this in the 1980s, right? I mean, particularly in the United States, where you have Ronald Reagan going after Angela Davis, who, by the way, will be coming to MAC in March to give a talk. You have the rise of President John Silber at Boston University, who actually gave a talk to the Board of Governors that was published in which he said, I have made this a great university because I have rid it of all the critical theorists. I've gotten rid of all the feminists. I've gotten rid of all the African-American theorists. And it goes on and on. It's like all the groups that matter, in a university in some fundamental way. He went out of his way to deny tenure to. Of course, I was one. And they were gone. They were gone. He controlled the Board of Governors. There was nothing to be done. There was no appeal. In my case, it was really interesting because I went through the process unanimously at all levels of the university. I went to my dean and I said, can I buy a house? What do you think? Oh, buy a house. Yeah, go right out and buy a house, right? That was fine, which I did, unfortunately. And then I met John Silber. And he calls me into his room and we sit down. By the way, he just died the other day, unfortunately. And he said, I hear you're such a great teacher. Why do you write such shit? And that was the beginning of our conversation. And then at the end of the conversation, he said to me, look, I'll make a deal with you. If you allow me to be your personal tutor for the next 2 years around questions of science, education, culture, and something else, who knows, he said, I will freeze your salary and allow you to be reconsidered for tenure at the end of 2 years. And I said to him very gently, I said, what are you trying to do, turn me into George Will? And, who was a conservative newspaper columnist whose brain is completely unburdened by a complicated thought. He then faced the wall, and I am near the door, and I guess the conversation was over, and I left. That was the end of that. In addition to that, we could say that what needs to be understood and particularly in that case, and something I never forgot, is that higher education may be one of the few public spheres left where knowledge, values, and learning offer a glimpse of the promise of education for nurturing public values, critical hope, and substantive democratic practices. It may be the case that everyday life is increasingly organized around market principles, but confusing a market-determined society with democracy hollows out the legacy of higher education, whose deepest roots, it seems to me, are moral and not commercial. This is particularly important in a society where the free circulation of ideas are not only being replaced by ideas managed by the dominant media, but where critical ideas increasingly are viewed or dismissed as banal, if not reactionary. Celebrity culture and the commodification of culture now constitute a powerful form of mass illiteracy and increasingly permeate all aspects of the educational force of the wider cultures. Do we really want to see another image of the Kardashian sisters? I mean, hello? Do we really want to see another reality TV program where somebody is number one and on top? A program that simply mimics in Hollywood fashion the very values that drive neoliberalism? I mean, it's just endless. But mass illiteracy does more than depoliticize the public. It also becomes complicit with the suppression of dissent. Intellectuals who engage in dissent and keep the idea and hope of a public culture alive are often dismissed as irrelevant, extremist, or un-American, particularly in the United States, much less here. Moreover, anti-public intellectuals now dominate, notice this, anti-public intellectuals now dominate the larger cultural landscape, all too willing to flaunt co-option and reap the rewards of venting insults at their assigned opponents while being reduced to the status of paid servants of powerful economic interest. You see, I mean, you see them every day on TV. It's hard to miss them, right? I mean, they have like 30-second sound bites. Everything they say is about how terrible the public sphere is, what a pathology it is. Everything they say is about people who depend on each other. That's horrible. That's a weakness. We don't need a social safety net for people who don't have any food because that's a form of dependency. That's a poison. That'll make people lazy. I love that argument when it comes with people with trust funds. I mean, I love that argument when it comes from people who, are in the upper 1% of the upper 1/10 of 1%. I mean, I love that argument from people who, for the most part, have never had to even experience what it means to be on food stamps, to raise a family, as if that doesn't demand an effort, as if working class people who are caught in those kinds of economic, political, and social problems are not working their asses off every day just to survive. But in that neoliberal logic of defamation, it's not a systemic breakdown in the system that has placed them there. It's about the defamation of character. So the homeless are lazy. So the unemployed don't want to fill out an application for a job, right? So kids who are having trouble in schools, we need to put them on Ritalin because it's a chemical problem. And it goes on and on. We talk about when we talk about state racism, oh no, we talk about prejudice because that's a psychological issue, see? And that's something that we can pinpoint on individuals, but not to talk about how it's systemically produced in the larger society. It seems to me that reclaiming higher education as a democratic public sphere begins with the crucial project of challenging, among other things, those market fundamentalists, religious extremists, and rigid ideologues who harbor a deep disdain for critical thought and healthy skepticism, and who look with displeasure upon any form of education that teaches students not only how to read the world, but also how to read the word. The radical imagination in this discourse is viewed as dangerous and a dire threat to political authorities. Of course, one striking example of this was expressed recently by one of the most profound intellectuals on the right, Rick Santorum, who unapologetically argued that there is no room for intellectuals in the Republican Party. Which says something about why Rick is there, right? I mean, although we don't want to write him and tell him that. If higher education is to characterize itself as a site of critical thinking, collective work, and public service, it seems to me that educators and students are going to have to redefine the knowledge, the skills, the research, and the intellectual practices currently favored in the university. And central to such a position, a challenge, is the need to position intellectual practice as part of an intricate web of morality, rigor, and responsibility that enables academics to speak with conviction, use the public spheres to address important social problems, and demonstrate alternative models for bridging the gap between higher education and the broader society. Connective practices are key. It is crucial to develop intellectual practices that are collegial rather than competitive, refuse the instrumentality and privileged isolation of the academy, link critical thought to a profound impatience with the status quo, and connect human agency to the idea of social responsibility and the politics of possibility. This business of translation is, as you all know, I'm sure, is no small matter. And it seems to me that it places the question of pedagogy right at the heart of the question of politics. Because if we can't translate personal issues into larger public concerns, as C. Wright Mills, Hannah Arendt, my friend Zygmunt Bauman, and a whole range of theorists have been reminding us for the last 50 years, you lose the formative culture that makes a democracy possible. It's gone. It disappears. Because there's no way to read the signs in ways that get us beyond the immediacy of the experience that we're looking at. So increasingly in a culture that refuses that translation, you have the collapse of public life into private considerations. Morality becomes a private affair. Fair enough? Entertainment is about one's private life. How we narrate ourselves in public is always about whether or not, we took a particular pill and it worked. I mean, it goes on and on. We're swamped with a discourse of illiteracy. And I say political illiteracy because it's an illiteracy that refuses to make connections. It refuses to connect the everyday with broader social considerations. It has no sense of the totality and how that totality works to give meaning. For instance, you can't, in my estimation, talk about the assault on public schools, particularly in the United States, without talking about neoliberalism. It's almost impossible to do that. And to do that, as some people do, is to really not be able to see what the nature of the larger problem is. Connection also means being openly and deliberately critical. And to say the least, it echoes what George Orwell called being able to establish some kind of critical response to what we might call the official truth of the establishment point of view. And lacking a self-consciously democratic political focus, teachers are often reduced to the role of technicians or functionaries engaged in formalistic rituals, unconcerned with the disturbing and urgent problems that confront a larger society. For that matter, are they concerned? They really seem to be concerned with the consequences of one's pedagogical practices and research undertaking. It seems to me that in opposition to this model, with its claim and conceit of political neutrality, I argue that academics should combine the mutually interdependent roles of critical educator and active citizen. And this requires finding ways to connect the practice of classroom teaching with the operation of power in the larger society, and to provide the conditions for students to view themselves as critical agents, capable of making those who exercise and power answerable for their actions. Such an intellectual does not train students solely for jobs, but also educates them to question critically the institutions, the policies, the values that shape their lives and their relationships to others, as well as their myriad connections to the larger world. I think Stuart Hall is right on target here when he insists that educators also have a responsibility to provide students with critical knowledge that has to be ahead of traditional knowledge. It has to be better than anything that traditional knowledge can produce, because only serious ideas are going to stand up. At the same time, he insists on the need for educators to actually engage, contest, and learn from the best that is locked up in other traditions, especially those attached to traditional academic paradigms. I think that what's at stake here is to simply make the claim that one has a commitment to some progressive legacy, at the same time doesn't qualify that one operate within a discourse of political purity, that one can't learn from the other, that one can't learn from traditions in some ways that one might be opposed to, that one can't open a dialogue in some way with traditions that, for the most part, are simply dismissed. One of the things that I often see at Mac is I often see students, for instance, who they don't see the university as a site of struggle. They see the university as simply a dominant apparatus, a dominant institutional apparatus. So there's no room here in this discourse to talk about what can be changed. There's only a discourse of critique, which basically writes off the university as an institution that no longer needs to be struggled over. And I think that's dangerous. Education cannot be decoupled from what Jacques Derrida calls a democracy to come. That is, a democracy that must always be open to the possibility of being contested, of contesting itself, of criticizing and indefinitely improving itself. Within this project of possibility and impossibility, education must be understood as a deliberately informed and purposeful political and moral practice, as opposed to one that is either doctrinaire or instrumentalized, or both. Moreover, critical pedagogy should be engaged at all levels of schooling. Similarly, it must gain part of its momentum in higher education among students who will go back to the schools, the churches, the synagogues, and workplaces in order to produce new ideas, new concepts, and new ways of understanding the world in which young adults and young people actually live. This is a notion of intellectual practice and responsibility that refuses the insular, overly pragmatic, and privileged isolation of the academy. It also affirms a broader vision of learning that links knowledge to the power of self-definition and to the capacities of students to expand the scope of democratic freedoms, particularly those that address the crisis of education, politics, and the social as part and parcel of the crisis of democracy itself. In order for critical pedagogy, dialogue, and thought to have real effects, they must advocate the message that all citizens, young and old, are equally entitled, if not equally empowered, to shape the society in which they live. This is a message we have heard from the brave students fighting tuition hikes and the destruction of civil liberties and social provisions in Quebec, and it's a message that we have heard in France. It's a message that we have heard with the Wall Street movement in the United States. And if educators are to function as public intellectuals, they need to listen to young people all over the world who are insisting that the relationship between knowledge and power can be emancipatory, that their histories and experiences matter, and that what they do and say counts in their struggle to unlearn dominating privileges, productively reconstruct their relations with others, and transform, when necessary, the world around them. Simply put, educators need to argue for forms of pedagogy that close the gap between the university and everyday life. The curricula need to be organized around knowledges of those communities, cultures, and traditions that give students a sense of history, identity, place, and possibility. And although there are still a number of academics, such as Noam Chomsky, Angela Davis, Stanley Aronowitz, Zizek, Russell Jacoby, Cornel West, to name a few, who function as public intellectuals, they're often shut out of the mainstream media or characterized as marginal, even subversive figures. At the same time, many academics find themselves laboring under horrendous working conditions that either don't allow for them to write in an accessible manner for the public because they don't have the time, given that almost slave-like labor demanded on the part of these part-time workers and increasingly of full-time academics as well. Consequently, such intellectuals often exist in hermetic academic bubbles, cut off from both the larger public and the important issues that impact society. And to no small degree, they have been complicit in the transformation of the university into an adjunct of corporate and military power. This is not a call to say that all work has to be directly political. And it's not an argument to suggest that in some way people have to move away from their specialties and not engage in important theoretical work. It's an argument that says that we might want to be aware of the conditions that make that work possible and what it might mean to defend those conditions as public intellectuals. I mean, it seems to me, to look around you and see the waves of the dark clouds emerging everywhere, and to see these attacks on the university coming from every such direction, it's odd that the people who seem to be the least capable of defending higher education seem to be the people who have the most investment in it. The faculty. I mean, that's a real problem. Before his untimely death, Edward Said, himself an exemplary public intellectual, urged his colleagues in the academy to directly confront those social hardships that disfigure contemporary society and pose a threat to the promise of democracy. He urged them to assume the role of public intellectuals, wakeful and mindful of their responsibilities to bear testimony to human suffering and the pedagogical possibilities at work in educating students to be autonomous, self-reflective, and socially responsible. Said rejected the notion of a market-driven pedagogy, one that created cheerful robots and legitimated organized recklessness and illegal legalities. I can't help, given my own background, I can't help but find myself actually, my jaw down and my eyes glazed when I hear Obama and that group talking about how they surround themselves with the best and the brightest. There is a sense that if you go to Harvard or Yale or Princeton and you get your degrees, all of a sudden you have like a brain click, right? That somehow is going to be able to, not lie about Iraq, not get us into Afghanistan, not push the debt right over the cliff, not address questions of racism. This may be the stupidest group we've ever seen in the history of political analyses. And yet, there's no connection between understanding that particular kind of cultural capital and the criminogenic environment in which it's often nurtured and the impact that it really has in relation to all spheres of public life. In opposition to such the pedagogy as the pedagogy of cheerful robots, Said argued for what he called the pedagogy of wakefulness and its related concern with the politics of critical engagement. And in commenting on Said's public pedagogy of wakefulness and how it shaped his important consideration of academics as public intellectuals, I begin with a passage that I think offers a key to the ethical and political force of much of his writing. The selection is taken from his memoir, Out of Place, which describes the last few months of his mother's life in a New York hospital and the difficult time she had falling asleep because of the cancer that was ravaging her body. Recalling this traumatic and pivotal experience, Said's mediation moves between the existential and the insurgent, between private pain and worldly commitment, between the seductions of a solid self and the reality of a contradictory, questioning, restless, and uneasy sense of identity. He writes, "Help me to sleep, Edward," she once said to me with a piteous trembling in her voice that I can still hear as I write. But then the disease spread to her brain, and for the last 6 weeks she slept all the time. My own inability to sleep may be her last legacy to me, a counter to her struggle for sleep. For me, sleep is something to be gotten over as quickly as possible. I can only go to bed very late, but I'm literally up at dawn. Like her, I don't possess the secret of long sleep, though unlike her, I have reached a point where I don't want it. For me, sleep is death, as is any diminishment in awareness. Sleeplessness, for me, is a cherished state to be desired at almost any cost. There is nothing for me as invigorating as immediately shedding the shadowy half-consciousness of a night's lost in the early morning, reacquainting myself with or resuming what I might have lost completely a few hours earlier. I occasionally experience myself as a cluster of flowing currents, and I prefer this to the idea of a solid self, the identity to which so many attach so much significance. The currents, like the themes of one's life, flow along during the waking hours, and at their best, they require no reconciling, no harmonizing. They are off and maybe out of place, but at least they're always in motion, in time, in place, in the form of all kinds of strange combinations, about not necessarily forward, sometimes against each other, contrapuntally, yet without one central theme. A form of freedom I like to think, even if I am far from being totally convinced that it is. That skepticism, too, is one of the themes I particularly want to hold on to. With so many dissonances in my life, I've learned to actually prefer being not quite right and out of place. It is in this sense of being awake, displaced, caught in a combination of diverse circumstances that suggest a pedagogy that is cosmopolitan and imaginative, a publicly affirming pedagogy that demands a critical and engaged interaction with the world we live in, mediated by a responsibility for challenging structures of domination and for alleviating human suffering. And as an ethical and political practice, a public pedagogy of wakefulness rejects modes of education removed from political and social concerns, divorced from history and matters of injury and injustice. Said's notion of pedagogy of wakefulness includes lifting complex ideas into the public space. I love that phrase. I wish I had written it. Lifting complex ideas into the public space. Another moment of translation, right? Another way of entering the university and looking out and seeing what possibilities might exist in this particular case by lifting the ideas we deal with in a space in which they can be engaged, dialogued over, interrogated, and in some way put to the kind of use that can create the conditions for the kind of agency that turns things around. This is a pedagogy in which academics are neither afraid of controversy or the willingness to make connections that are otherwise hidden, nor are they afraid of making clear the connection between private issues and broader elements of society's problems. For Said, being awake becomes a central metaphor for defining the role of academics, again, as public intellectuals, defending the university as a crucial public sphere, and engaging how culture deploys power, and taking seriously the idea of human interdependence, while at the same time always living on the border, one foot in and one foot out, an exile and an insider for whom home was always a form of homelessness. As a relentless border crosser, Said embraced the idea of the traveler as an important metaphor for engaged intellectuals. As Stephen Howe, referencing Said, points out, it was an image which depended not on power, but on motion, on daring to go into different worlds, use different languages, and understand a multiplicity of disguises, masks, and rhetorics. Travelers must suspend the claim of customary routine in order to live in new rhythms and rituals. The traveler crosses over, traverses territory, and abandons fixed positions for all times. And as a border intellectual and traveler, Said embodied the notion of always being quite not right, evident by his principal critique of all forms of certainty and dogmas, and his refusal to be silent in the face of human suffering at home and abroad. Being awake meant refusing the now popular sport of academic bashing, or embracing a crude call for action at the expense of rigorous intellectual and theoretical work. On the contrary, it meant combining rigor and clarity on the one hand and civic courage and political commitment on the other. A pedagogy of wakefulness meant using theory as a resource, not dismissing it, but also not turning it into a form of theoreticism. Recognizing the worldly space of criticism as the democratic underpinning of publicness, defining critical literacy not merely as a competence, but as an act of interpretation linked to the possibility of intervention in the world. It pointed to a kind of border literacy in the plural, in which people learn to read and write from multiple positions of agency. It was also indebted to the recognition forcibly stated by Hannah Arendt that without a politically guaranteed public realm, freedom lacks the worldly space to make its appearance. For public intellectuals such as Said, Chomsky, Bourdieu, Angela Davis, and others, intellectuals have a responsibility to unsettle power, trouble consensus, and challenge common sense. The very notion of being an engaged intellectual is neither foreign to nor a violation of what it means to be an academic scholar, but central to its very definition. According to Said, and according to, of course, Noam Chomsky, academics have a duty to enter into the public sphere unafraid to take positions and to generate controversy, functioning as moral witnesses, raising political awareness, making connections to those elements of power and politics often hidden from public view, and reminding the audience of the moral questions that may be hidden in the clamor and the din of public debate. At the same time, he criticized those academics who retreated into a new dogmatism of the disinterested specialist that separates them not only from the public sphere, but from other professionals who don't use the same jargon. This was especially unsettling to him at a time when complex language and critical thought remained under assault in the larger society by all manner of anti-democratic forces. The view of higher education as a democratic public sphere committed to producing young people capable and willing to expand and deepen their sense of themselves, to think the world critically, to imagine something other than their own well-being, to serve the public good, and to struggle for a substantive democracy has been in a state of crisis for the last 30 years. When faculty assume, in this context, their civic responsibility to educate students to think critically, to act with conviction, and connect what they learn in the classroom to important social issues in the larger society, they're often denounced for politicizing the classroom and for violating professional codes of conduct, or worse, labeled as unpatriotic. And of course, in Canada, they're labeled as uncivil. In some cases, the risk of connecting what they teach to the imperative to expand the capacities of students to be both critically and socially engaged may cost academics their jobs, especially when they make visible the workings of power, injustice, and human misery, and the alterable nature of the social order. It seems to me that despite the growing public recognition that market fundamentalism has fostered a destructive alignment among the state, corporate capital, and transnational corporations, there is little understanding that such an alignment has been constructed and solidified through a neoliberal disciplinary apparatus and corporate pedagogy produced in part in the halls of higher education and through the educational force of the larger media. There seems to be an enormous disconnect between the economic conditions that led, for instance, to the current financial meltdown and the current call to action by a generation of young people and adults who have been educated for the last several decades in the knowledge, values, and identities of a market-driven society. Higher education represents one of the most important sites over which the battle for democracy is being waged. It's a site where the promise for a better future emerges out of those visions and pedagogical practices that combine hope, agency, politics, and moral responsibility as part of a more emancipatory discourse. But more importantly, academics as engaged scholars can further the activation of knowledge, passion, and values and hope in the service of forms of agency that are crucial to sustaining a democracy, in which higher education plays an important, it would seem to me, civic, critical, and pedagogical roles. Finally, I want to suggest that while it's been more difficult to imagine, it becomes increasingly more difficult to imagine a democratic future, we have entered a period in which young people all over the world are protesting against neoliberalism and its pedagogy and politics of disposability. Refusing to remain voiceless and powerless in determining their future, these young people are organizing collectively in order to create the conditions for society that refuse to use politics as an act of war and markets as the measure of democracy. They are taking seriously the words of the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who bravely argued that freedom is an empty abstraction if people fail to act, and if there is no struggle, in his famous phrase, there is no progress. Their struggles are not simply aimed at the 1%, but also the 99% as part of a broader effort to get them to connect the dots, educate themselves, and develop and join social movements that can rewrite the language of democracy and put into place the institutions and formative cultures that make it possible. The current protest in the United States, Canada, Greece, and Spain make clear that this is indeed and cannot be only a short-term project of reform, but a political movement that needs to intensify, accompanied by the reclaiming of public spaces, the progressive use of digital technologies, the development of public spheres, the production of new modes of education, and the safeguarding of places where democratic expression, new identities, and collective hopes can be nurtured and mobilized. A formative culture must be put in place pedagogically and institutionally in a variety of settings, extending from churches and synagogues to public higher education. It seems to me this suggests not only calling for a living wage in terms of linking social movements to particular platforms. This suggests not only calling for a living wage, job programs, especially for the young, the democratization of power, economic equality, and massive shifts in funds away from the machinery of war and big banks, but also a social movement that engages in critique, that makes hope a real possibility by organizing to actually seize power. There's no room for failure here, because failure would cast us back into the clutches of authoritarianism, that while different from previous historical periods, shares nonetheless the imperative to proliferate violent social formations and a death-dealing blow to the promise of democracy to come. I realize that this sounds a bit utopian, but we have few choices if we're going to fight for a future that does a great deal more than endlessly repeat the present. Given the urgency of problems faced by those marginalized by class, race, age, disability, and sexual orientation, I think it's all the more crucial to take seriously the challenge of Derrida's provocation that we must do and think the impossible. If only the possible happened, nothing more would happen. If I only did what I can do, I wouldn't do anything. We may live in dark times, as Hannah Arendt reminds us, but history is open, and the space of the possible is larger than the one on display. Thank you.